10, which I used to do regularly because I wanted to see what was happening, you would find long excerpts from the Iliad or the Odyssey, or maybe the Aeneid, something that was relevant to this particular standard. It was high school level reading. And there was a long enough passage so that students had to read more than a paragraph, because I looked at one of the samples of grade 11 items that came out of one of the testing consortia. You get to be good at it when you've had to read thousands of these examples. And it had one paragraph from John Locke, one paragraph, and 2 paragraphs from a Susan B. Anthony speech. And the question that the kids had to answer, now this was simply a sample item, we don't know if it was going to be really something or similar to what would be on the real test. It said, show how John Locke supports Susan B. Anthony's ideas. And I thought, this also is a screwy kind of example. John Locke preceded by a couple of centuries Susan B. Anthony. He had nothing to do with women's right to vote. I'm not against women's right to vote, but that's not the purpose of any of this. And how is reading a paragraph of John Locke an example that would help to determine someone's readiness for college? I mean, there are a whole bunch of things you could say about this one example that are problematic, but it was the leading question that obviously was designed to make sure that the kids were off on the right start, that they wouldn't start saying, well, John Locke was opposed to Susan B. Anthony because he's a dead white male or something like that. They wanted to make sure that kids wouldn't get lost saying the wrong thing, I'm sure. So they're making sure that they understand they have to say, John Locke is supporting Susan B. Anthony because, et cetera, even though he was writing about the British monarchy and about something that had nothing to do with whatever she was getting at in this particular excerpt from her speech. So you have to look at these examples to try to understand how they're interpreting these empty skills, generic skills in English language arts, and to realize that there are going to be problems in the school. Superintendents are going to have to figure this out. Their English departments are going to have to figure this out, unless they go back to the document they've been using and try literally to maybe just impose the level of skill on the content they once had, which they've been using now for close to 15 years. That might be the only way they can save their sanity in some ways and make sure that the kids are learning something. But it all depends on the quality of the works they're choosing. I am not against certain kinds of, obviously, good nonfiction being taught and used. It always was in the English class. Goodness knows there have always been some autobiographical, biographical pieces, essays, and speeches. The Gettysburg Address was always taught when I went to school in grade 8 in the English class. We would memorize it and then analyze the language used by Lincoln. So this was something that was always part of what an English teacher knew how to do, to analyze the rhetoric of nonfiction. But to do some of these things, third problem, and this is the illustration of it, is that it asks students from grade 5 or 6 on to make claims when they write and to show evidence from what they've read. And I happened to see a group of New York City kids whose papers had been hung up because the teachers had been selected for the applications that they had proposed for this exhibit to show how they were working on Common Core's writing standards for composition. Goodness knows most English teachers years ago didn't start the art of the essay until grade 9, because the conceptual structure of an essay, where you make some thesis statement or assert a controlling idea and then have whatever you want to illustrate pro and con, where your evidence comes from, it takes a long time to develop that kind of meta-control of your writing, which is the last thing to develop. But grade 5 kids, how are they going to come up with a claim? And sure enough, those teachers had all kinds of commercial and teacher-made handouts to try to get these poor kids to learn how to make a claim. And then I looked at what these kids were reading, because I'm thinking to myself, if I were a teacher in grade 5, I couldn't teach a claim unless I gave them a piece of writing to read that had a claim in it, and you could identify it, controlling idea, topic sentence, whatever. They were teaching them to read short stories. Well, short stories don't have claims in them. They don't even have paragraphs with topic sentences. The whole thing was screwed up. But the teachers didn't realize this because they were following what was in Common Core standards. But they were not written by people who had any understanding of standards. That's all I think I'm going to say, and I'll let questions stop. Because I think there's going to be a huge mess in the schools to clean up. Okay.
We have time for some questions, and Agatha, did you want a question? Or?
I do. Was it ever tested? I can't remember if you said that or not.
The Common Core?
Yes.
Oh, no, because they were just developed in 2009, 2010 by people who've never had any experience with standards. Now, they kept claiming that they were piggybacking off of the Massachusetts standards, because I still had people that I knew in the Department of Ed, and I would ask, I have David Coleman and Susan Pimentel been here recently to speak to some people who might be able to help them with these terrible standards they're creating, because I was constantly writing critiques and passing them out on the Board of Ed. And yes, they were coming maybe like once every month or two to talk to people in the Department of Ed who had nothing to do with this document. Never once did they want to speak to me. This isn't personal pique. I mean, I was on the validation committee, but they could have easily spoken to me. Nor did they ever ask to speak to any of the people who had had something to do with this. So my question has been always, what did they learn by coming to the Department of Ed? I don't know who they spoke to, what they learned. They certainly didn't learn anything about this document that was useful, because whatever I could see in terms of a few key words that might have shown that they were copying something, they managed to distort, because they would put it at the wrong level, paraphrase it wrongly. I mean, I'm a reader, and I'm also very able to understand how a standard should read and where the standard comes from, because I've read so many standards documents, and they were always messing it up. So we have a different problem. And they talk about close reading, but they never did close reading of this document.
Question in the back?
For deep thinking.
Thank you so much for coming up from Arkansas, backward state of Massachusetts.
I retired back here.
Even though you got fired.
Oh, good for you.
I'm really disturbed. I have dozens of questions, but it's clear they're not all going to be answered tonight. But I have one really important one. The Texas legislature has been on national news and the press on TV recently because, again, there's this huge debate over how to treat evolution. That's not my question. My question is that in Texas, it appears to me that the state legislature actually votes on the standards or curriculum or syllabus, whatever you want to call it. And what I'm not clear on, and I think would be helpful to a lot of people here, is if we want to be instrumental in changing these standards, what is the process? How does the legislature interact with this Massachusetts School Board? Who makes the rules and regulations? Where are the hearings? And where are the opportunities for public input?
Yeah. These are some of the questions I tried to raise when I was on the validation committee, because I had been used to being on a library board that was subject to sunshine laws. I was used to being a town meeting member where no one could do anything unless it was part of the procedure for town meeting. There were no civic procedures at all for the adoption that were followed by our State Board of Education, except for my nagging for one open meeting in which we would get higher ed people interacting with high school people. It wasn't quite that way, but at least there was an open meeting. And one of the writers came, Jason Zimba, who was one of the math writers. And I asked him, I said, in lay terms, can you tell me what the college readiness level means mathematically? I was going to say that earlier, and I don't think I finished that piece of it. He told us, it was an open meeting, and it's in the minutes, He said it means minimal readiness for a non-selective college. That is what college readiness in mathematics meant. Now, what is the procedure? How could you get a Board of Ed? I kept saying, shouldn't we be talking about college readiness? Shouldn't we be asking X, Y, Z questions? And the chair said, well, you know, nobody's asking these questions. That's true. I was the only one asking these questions. So, and there was nobody to answer them. Nobody was interested on the Board of Ed. So where do you go from here? The legislature doesn't have to approve, as far as I understand, what a state Board of Ed decides. And this is true in some states, but not in others. There is a state law that may be different across states, I've discovered, on this matter. But in this state, there are certainly state legislators are one good group to contact because they are subject to being voted on every 2 years. They voted for the Mass Ed Reform Act, so they have a role in directing a Department of Education, which is under the administration. So that's the angle there. The state legislature can pass legislation that directs, as it did with the question 3 many years ago on immersion as opposed to TBE, transitional bilingual education. That came about through an initiative petition, I believe. That's another powerful way. It costs money, that's the problem. But an initiative petition probably would be the best way to get out the vote for getting, if a judge is going to allow it. I mean, you still have some legal hurdles, I know, in this state that can play games with that. Your state legislators are responsible, and local school committees should also be responsible. Now, if a local school committee, which by the way, in most states, not only here, they were totally bypassed by a vote by the governor, the commissioner of ed, and the chair of the state board of ed. Most local school committees, school boards, were bypassed. They weren't even given the courtesy of being told what Common Core was. Their teachers knew nothing. The superintendents might have been told in a directive from the Commissioner of Education in the state, but that's as far as it went. When I speak to state legislators, as Jamie mentioned, the first thing they want to know is, what is Common Core? Why are we being hit with this bill? They don't, even 3 years later, don't understand what it was. Teachers are just beginning to find out what it is because they're being told they've got to now shape curricula around it. So there was no public process for explaining it. That's part of what Governor Pence in Indiana is asking for, meetings across the state to explain to the public something that the Board of Ed claimed it had already done, but there was no record of it. But what the Board of Ed failed to do, other boards of ed have claimed that they've had public processes. In California, this lie was picked up right away. There's a whole bunch of lies out there. But the superintendent of the schools in Thousand Oaks said, oh, there were public meetings across the state. California adopted it early July. Final version came out in June. California adopts it in July. He said, oh, there were public meetings across the state. And someone else on the panel said, there's no record of any taking place.
I'd like to address that too, because that's the second question that essentially asked the same thing. What can we do? And it was the question that we asked Jamie and Sandra at dinner. What can we do? We don't have all the answers, but you see this tonight? This is the kind of thing we can do to start. And so I was going to mention this at the end, but in the back, there's a sign-up sheet. Put your email on there, because we can't act individually against a process like this. But if we get together and learn and teach each other what to do and bring in speakers like this, that's when we at least get some direction. So I'm just going to say that now, and I'm going to hand it off for another question. Are there any other questions? Oh, so there's a few questions left out there, and then we're going to wrap up.
That's Sandy, yeah. Thank you. I have a question about the consultants. Do you know who are they, what are their qualifications, and where do they come from, if you know?
They simply emerge. The one that was used in Fayetteville, I looked her up because I got her name from my teacher friend. She was a Teacher of the Year in Colorado. I couldn't even find her vita. I couldn't figure out whether she had ever even majored in English. Nothing. She only has this company of consultants that she sends out, and she claims that she's a Common Core consultant. Now, whether she went to some meeting or workshop that was paid for by the Gates Foundation, I don't know. I mean, I can't tell you that I know where she came from because it wasn't available. But Fayetteville Public Schools, which is a good public school system, one of the best in Arkansas, obviously paid her good money and must have had her recommended by somebody. But where she was recommended from, they weren't going to tell me.
Question.
I just wanted to recommend that anyone who wants information about the legislature can go online to nalegislature.gov. They find it pretty good.
Last question over here. Oh, we have two last questions. First, we'll go to Alice. And then we're just going to make 2 minutes worth of closing comments, and it's late, we'll let everyone out. Class almost dismissed.
This all sounds to me like a part of Agenda 21. Coming from the UN, I don't know. It just feels like that because it seems like it's setting up our students to be indoctrinated. And I don't know, maybe I'm way off base, but I feel that this is not a good thing. And I feel it is a part of the Agenda 21. I don't know, but
That
the way
I
I feel.
can't comment on, but certainly there has been no open public process. How many people in Massachusetts at the school level knew about what was entailed by Common Core? Did the college level people even know? Because they're the ones that are going to be ultimately